Thank you all so much for joining today. I'm so excited, as we've all talked about, to dive into this topic. I definitely agree. It's not something that I've personally ever learned a lot about, so this will be amazing. First off, a bit of background information on our esteemed expert. Martha is a supply chain professional with over 8 years of comprehensive experience working with small and large companies. Her past work in project management and business development ranges from Fortune 100 enterprises to consumer tech startups and spans industries including telecom, retail, and tech. Martha has managed digital transformations of operation systems and led the reserve and roastery logistics strategy at Starbucks. So she knows firsthand of the difficulties that occur when scaling too fast or too slow. Martha, we are so excited to learn from your expertise today. We know how valuable your time is, and we're so grateful that you're giving back to the collective in this way. Before we get started, I also wanted to flag that Martha has so generously offered to connect one-on-one with anyone who has tuned in today about their specific supply chain questions in case they aren't covered in today's session, or if you want to go deeper in your specific situation. So a few examples that you could cover in a one-on-one session with Martha are risk assessment, the importance of putting people first from the beginning, lessons from big companies, how to develop your particular supply chain, effectively scaling in your particular situation, and so much more. So I'm going to go ahead and drop her email in the comments, and then I'll also drop it again later on just so you can have it for easy access. So thank you so much again, Martha, for offering up your time. And also, this is going to be a very conversational, discussion-based presentation. So definitely feel free to drop any questions you have in the comments, and we will get those sorted to Martha. And on that note, Martha, you can take it away.
Great. Well, thanks so much for your time and attending. This is obviously what I do for my day job, and I think it hasn't been talked about too much in terms of a day to day. So I am excited that people have interest in this. I think it's really important for both small and big companies to focus on the back end, the operations and supply chain of a company. So as Hannah mentioned, like supply chain can be varying for each specific company and type of product. So my information that I provide here might be too general, so I'm happy to answer questions throughout the presentation, but if there's specific ones that you want to go through more deeply, happy to set up time and discuss more in depth, as you know, each company has its own particular supply chain and issues that might be a little bit different. So just an FYI on that. So today I really just want to cover, a couple different things that I'll go through is how supply chain shows up in our everyday lives, as we've seen in the last year, the importance of building a resilient and flexible supply chain for the future and key priorities to focus on. Supply chain process 101, just basics of where supply chain, what it means, the different processes and activities that happen, and scaling considerations that you should think about. And again, that might be general, but we can talk further in terms of what it might be for your specific situation on 101. And most importantly, how COVID-19 has impacted the global supply chain and things to consider for not only now, but the future. So hope that you're excited for this. This is definitely something I am passionate about, and hope that this brings you some knowledge, and excited to hear your questions. So I'll get started. So now let me go to the next slide. So in the last year, I can't believe it's almost been a year, pretty sure every single one of us has seen some type of news and seen some of these pictures where you've seen, vendors and farmers having to throw out food, seen delays in your shipments, have been seen brands kind of diversify their products that are diversified depending on what they have. And then of course, we've all seen and experienced the empty shelves and, the long lines and just experience of that. So to me, these are all things that, every single one of us has experienced, and it has to do with supply chain. So, and also just given COVID-19, where the state of the world is, but a lot of it has to do with demand and supply and demand, and how we as supply chain professionals think about solving these issues and how quickly we can adapt. So I'm sure everyone in the last year has experienced this in one way or another. And so I wanted to bring us to perspective on how supply chain impacts our daily lives without us really thinking about it until it really does. Right, next slide. So we will continue seeing disruptions like this, but COVID-19 has been the first in probably our lifetime that has fully disrupted our global supply chain in a way that we've never been prepared for. And some companies have thrived through it more than others, and some have really struggled. And companies really need to focus on making sure that they're creating and sustaining flexible and resilient supply chains. And that sounds easy, but it's actually really hard, especially depending on the scale of your supply chain. It's much easier for a smaller startup possibly to build a new supply chain and thinking about what's happening now. But behemoths like Starbucks, for example, there's a lot to make that happen, and when we're a slow moving ship sometimes to make that happen. But each whether it's a small company or a big company has its advantages and disadvantages about how quickly you can move. So a couple of different disruptions that we are predicting, and this is backed by research and some people at Starbucks as well, is continued global pandemics. This probably won't be the first and won't be the last global pandemic. And I think we've all learned what will need to happen in the future when we do this. Extreme weather. I mean, actually, in the last 3 years of me working at Starbucks, I've seen this firsthand as extreme weather keeps happening more and more, where our distribution centers are impacted, our stores are closed. All these things impact us in one way or another. And Starbucks, we have over 50,000 stores around the world, and every single community we are in, we are impacted. And so it's really important for us to be aware of that. And just similar to other issues like trade wars, labor shortage, those two things will continue being probably not as volatile as global pandemics, extreme weather, but the global politics do impact your prices, ability for you to move product easily through China and the US, and where you might think about moving your product. And labor shortage in terms of drivers, in terms of people working at distribution centers, all that does definitely impact your costs. So what you see in the news in one way or another will impact the way that you should think about your supply chain and how quickly you can adapt to that. And similarly to some of the other things, that supply and demand volatility, in the last year or so, it definitely has been up and down in terms of what customers, as we've seen how our own spending habits have changed, right? So just being able to quickly adapt to that is really important. And obviously national policies, whenever there's border closures or anything that can really impact the way that you can ship and receive goods, is really critical for you. So this slide really just is to continue thinking about how supply chains need to be flexible and resilient. And in the next couple of slides, I'll go through what's the two major priorities that you should think about that I think will be helpful to just frame where we should go. All right, so the number one, and I'm extremely passionate about this, is that putting people first. So supply chain, at the end of the day, is made by people. Like from the beginning to the end, if I'm thinking about Starbucks, from the farmers that work in our coffee farms to all the way to our baristas, every single part of that is done by people for people. So it's extremely important that from the beginning, especially if you're starting a new company or developing something new, is that you treat your suppliers, employees, and community with respect, dignity, and care. And why I say that's so important is because not only is it the right thing to do, but also you will see a financial return that's much more viable and continued longstanding relationships in those times of need. So, I don't know how much everyone outside of like seeing your Starbucks from every corner knows so much about Starbucks, but I truly believe that we, we're not a perfect company, but we, from the very beginning, have always, it's been very specific on our mission to do good with our scale. So from ethical sourcing from the very beginning and diversity suppliers to all the way to being able to work with suppliers that are doing the right thing. So I will tell you firsthand, in the last year, the amount of things that we've done, not only for our people and putting our partners, which are employees, first, has paid for so much more in terms of long-term relationships and care for our community. So I want to make sure that that's understood, because if your company is not going to do that when you're first doing we're first starting up, you won't do it when you're a big company. So it's important from the very beginning to prioritize that every single step of the way you're thinking about how people are first, including health and safety, including benefits. All those things are really critical for sustaining a supply chain. And Hannah, I don't know if there's any questions, but I'm happy to take any questions if they're happening through chat or.
There haven't been any dropped in the chat yet, but everyone feel free to unmute yourself at any time. Well, after a slide, or drop questions in the chat whenever.
All right, next one is risk assessment and management. So I think this is probably the hardest, especially when you're starting out, is just being able, one, to understand the supply chain process. So in the next slide, I'll kind of walk us through all that, but it's important to have transparency, traceability, and data-driven decision-making throughout your supply chain. And the important reason is this, like if you think about it, when customers nowadays are wanting to know every single thing that they're about to buy. So if you are about to buy, well, I'll just make the example. For Starbucks, people want to know now not only where our coffee is from, but also how we treat our coffee farmers, how we treat the people that we work with. They want to know so much more than what they used to receive. So it's important not only to do the right thing, as I mentioned, but also be able to have that traceability and transparency of throughout the supply chain process. So one, you can have the risk assessment and understood if there is an issue, but also because it's important to the customer nowadays. So I think it's a great thing that customers are asking for it, because it asks for much more visibility and alignment for these companies to do the right thing. But it is really important that throughout the process that you have systems and resources and tools that allow you to have transparency and traceability, and most importantly, data-driven decision making. I think, to be honest, it's much easier for a small company to start with that versus a huge company like Starbucks, where we're just now, after almost 50 years, updating our systems, because obviously we have legacy systems that take a while to update, and just the amount of work it does. So I think that's one of the key benefits of smaller companies, is that you can add systems and resources tools a lot easier than trying to update a big company with their work. All right. So next one, I'll go through kind of supply chain 101. So I'll go through each part of the process and go through the different activities that happen and some considerations and recommendations to go through.
Before you dive in here, we did have one question come through.
Go for it.
What are some of the criteria that you look for when identifying/targeting a warehouse and distribution partner?
Awesome. So I will go through that a little bit more. I do have one area on distribution, so I will mention that a little bit more. That is a very important question.
Perfect.
So I'll keep that in mind when I go through distribution. All right, so I will get started with sourcing. So sourcing really is, at the end of the day, finding the right suppliers that will be able to meet, what your product is supposed to be. So if you're thinking about, our coffee, we work with coffee farmers around the world, and we also have, we don't just sell coffee, so we have everything from the furniture that's in our stores to the paper cups. Every single part of that you see in our store we work with a supplier to get that. So there's a process around supplier selection and process and contract negotiation. And I highly recommend making sure, one, that you have someone or a team, depending on the size, that has legal expertise, because this is where really a lot of mistakes are happening, is when those contracts are not fully understood, or don't understand the terms, or you don't negotiate a flexible contract that maybe when you start you only needed a certain volume, but as you get moving into a much larger scale, you might be stuck with those same terms that you first started with. So that's important to know. In addition, this is where kind of building those strong and transparent relationships with your suppliers. So one of the things that, my area of expertise is much more in distribution, which I'll get to later. But even there, I've worked with some of our vendors and that we had long-standing relationships with. And in those times of needs, especially throughout COVID-19, because we had such good relationships with them, they did things that probably would be much harder than if we were very new or did not have that same relationship. So for example, like over the summer last year, when we, customer demand was much lower. We had so much waste to go through. One of our various suppliers around the country that I worked with our kind of our fancy line, which is a reserve and roastery line that we have, we worked with them to be able to do kind of an ad hoc delivery to some of our food banks that we worked with. So all the food that was being wasted during that time, we had a really good, strong partnership with them, and they were also invested in our community. So they were also interested in doing that win-win situation. And that, again, is having those strong, transparent supplier relationships. Another example is that when we first kind of understood the impact of COVID-19 to Starbucks and just the world, was that we actually went ahead and called every single supplier, understood what their risk was, like, do they have enough labor to fulfill the demand that we have? How are they handling COVID-19 in their area? Like, how all these things that, like, if you don't have that strong and transparent relationship, they might be just telling you, yeah, Starbucks, like, we have it all good, and then they're not able to deliver. So you really want to have those honest conversations so that you understand the risk and you can mitigate that. And most importantly, that you're not caught blindsided if there is an issue. So that, again, supplier performance. And, Starbucks does a lot of, like, we end up having, I believe, depending, we have a lot of suppliers that we work with, but they have a cadence that they talk to suppliers and understand their performance in terms of the amount of issues that they have, defects, quality assurance, all that. But also, again, and this is how, depending on how you set up your company and what's important to you as in values, we also work with them to understand their values in terms of how they put people first, how they're doing in terms of that. So it's really a ongoing relationship, and making sure that not only is it a one-way relationship, but a two-way, and seeing how we can help them grow. So that's important. And in terms of kind of my earlier stance of making sure that in terms of your contract negotiation, in terms of volume. So you might start with a company and you think, hey, I only need, I don't know, 100 cases of product a week, but then demand goes up, you grow as a company, and maybe that supplier doesn't have adequate resources and capacity to go much higher than the volume that you're expecting. So one, diversifying your supplier base is important. So don't only go with one supplier. Make sure you have ample of different suppliers you could work with in case of your growth. And so it's important to have that, and also just understand how their business operates. So that way you're not caught blindsided if your growth expands, or if there's an issue, their capacity limits and expansion. Any questions so far? Okay. And then the last one, kind of similar to my earlier point, for us at Starbucks, ethical sourcing is extremely important, and we have a dedicated team that works on that. And so again, I think it's, especially nowadays, this is what customers want and are expecting out of companies, to really think about how you're working with your suppliers, what they're doing in terms of fair labor, fair living wage, all those different things that include ethical sourcing. And that is really started from the beginning, because I believe that if you start that and invest that work in the beginning, it will pay long-standing with your customers and your suppliers.
I have a question at this point, if that's all right.
Yeah.
So around ethical sourcing, I have a skincare company. And one of the issues have been dealing with suppliers of raw ingredients and having some sort of, because it's mostly international, having documentation that
Yes.
I see documentation, and sometimes I'm just like, I'm not really sure that that's meaningful or it's real or any of that kind of stuff. So do you have any insights on standard documentation I should be looking for?
I can get back to you on more specifics, because I definitely, there's a team, and actually one of them is my mentor, that works on our what we call manufactured goods. So think of our like furniture and everything in our stores. But she might have a little bit more like specifics on our documentation. But yes, it is really hard. I think one of the challenges of ethical sourcing is one, there's no standard. Like generally, there's no standard that we're seeing across the industry. It really is dependent on each company, which tends to be an issue, right? Because then yes, you're kind of verifying how true this is. And again, going back to the earlier conversation with, if you don't have those strong relationships with those suppliers, they might be lying to you, right? They want to get your business, and they might be saying everything's fine, and or they could also be outsourcing their own work, right? So they could, as we've seen with Apple and other companies, that they've gone into trouble where they thought they were working with one supplier, but that supplier is working with another, and you don't know the full transparency, and that's difficult.
I've definitely run into that as well. They're supplying ingredients from somebody else, and it's a difficult chain.
Yeah, and that's where, it's tough. Like when we've seen that on the news with Apple and all these other companies, is there's, unfortunately, the level of transparency is difficult to find. So especially once they get outsourcing to third parties, you don't have the full control. So you really have to build those strong relationships and make it understood of what your values as a company are, because otherwise it does become an issue and you may not be aware of it.
Okay, thank you.
But I will get back to you, and I know that there's documentation that I can help with.
Okay, thanks a lot.
I have 2 questions. One,
Sure.
what is ethical sourcing? And 2, investors are scared of investing in startups that manufacture in China, but China is so cheap. What do you recommend in situations like that?
So ethical sourcing, to get that question answered. So one, it's making sure that the suppliers you're working with are paying their people fairly, and the right living conditions, all that. I mean, for us at Starbucks, we have very specific ways of what we consider ethical sourcing, and I'm happy to share that a little bit more. But we think about the whole community, right? For example, we have, I think it's 6. I think we call them coffee support centers around the world, one being in Costa Rica, which is one of our main ones, where we do a lot of research and development there. But the way that we think about it is that if we're going to do long-term investment and relationships with our coffee farmers, we want to make sure the community is doing well, right? Because as we know, if your supplier is hungry or they're not doing well financially, they're not going to perform as well, right? So it's a win-win situation where we've made sure and we've invested in, providing the nutrition, education towards the community, so that is not only provides a better yield, but also that they feel good. So for us, it's a much bigger, answer. But one, I would say ingredient sourcing, making sure that's done fairly in terms of labor, that, you're not dealing with trade conflicts. Like examples that has come up is with Blood Diamonds, as I don't know if you guys ever watched that movie, but thinking about how it's being sourced. Is it done through violence or through any other exploitation for humans, and just thinking about the fair wage. And it's interesting because in the coffee world, there's different labels that you see for customers in terms of fair trade, organic, all these different things. They actually don't really mean much, because a lot of them don't actually practice what they preach, or a lot of times are not fully thinking about the full system. So we actually have our own called cafe practices, which again, I'll provide a little bit more detail what that means, but we really think about the environment, the community, and the ability to make sure we know transparently of all of our ingredients and where it's coming from, and as long as fair wage and people are treated correctly. And then your second question in terms of China. So yeah, I mean, especially now, one of the big things, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide, but with COVID-19 is when I said flexible and resilient supply chain, one of the biggest changes around that is that a lot of times supply chains are focused on the low cost, right? You want the ability to create and transport your goods at the lowest cost available. But is that actually going to create a resilient and flexible supply chain in times of need when you're actually looking for value? So a lot of right now that companies are thinking through is, does it make more sense to work with suppliers that are closer to home, so that if there is an issue, you're not dealing with issues with the US and China in terms of trade relations, and also in terms of distance. So it really depends on the size of your company, what you're trying to do, where your customers are, and most importantly, what your mission is. So I think it really depends, and also where your suppliers are. So if you're creating a product that most of the suppliers are in China, you might be in a gridlock that is where you have to work with. But it's also thinking about how you can work with other companies in other countries or even here in the US. It just depends on what you're valuing, whether it's the flexibility and resilience, that working from home, working from the US or closer to home, or the lower cost of working with China possibly. So it depends on your goals.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm gridlocked. I make ice packs for like
Okay.
a sore neck. Yeah, so I'm kind of gridlocked, but thank you.
Yeah. And again, happy to talk more in detail of specific cases, but that's at least what I'm kind of hearing. Okay, manufacturing. So this is one actually, I was kind of putting definitions here. This is tends to be very specific on the product you're creating. So there's some basics here, production process is really making sure from raw material to finished goods. But I, heard someone earlier, like, how do you, if you have one manufacturer and the other one manufacturer, like, how do you put it all together? It really depends on your supply chain process. So you might have, one supplier delivering to the other supplier and they consolidate that product. So much of it really depends on how many, if you're insourcing or outsourcing your manufacturing process. So for example, at Starbucks, we have things that we create and there's things that we don't. For example, if you go to a local CVS, or then they sell our frappuccinos, those are actually the what's called, the recipe and everything is Starbucks, but the bottle is actually PepsiCo. So we work with Pepsi to create that bottle and they do the finished manufacturing, right? So it really depends on your product and how it's being done and the process. So, you can look at, if you Google manufacturing process, it really will depend on the process, on the product that you're creating and what is needed each step of the way. But one thing too that's really important, regardless of what you're creating, is the production planning. So making sure you have the right raw material numbers and volumes for that, the right labor to support that, and just thinking through the workstation set to create that. So there's a lot of studies out there and a lot of different ways to do that. Some of you guys might have heard of lean, being able to make sure you're kind of doing things at one place and making sure that your people are doing one thing and one thing really well. And quality assurance. So that's a basic. Obviously, you don't want to create something and there's any defects before you provide it to the consumer. Depending on the industry that you're in, things are much more, there's stricter standards. For example, in food, there's a whole other world in terms of working with the FDA and the work that you're doing there. So it really depends. And so I would say that depending on the industry that you're in, and be very knowledgeable about that area, because the last thing you want to do is really get in trouble with any of these organizations that you could get any type of fine or issue with your customer in terms of legal battle. So it's really important to know for your specific industry. Scaling considerations to think about when you're thinking about your manufacturing process. It's very similar to sourcing, as I mentioned. When you're first starting out, you may not need a necessary your own manufacturing process or manufacturing center. And so you might say, hey, I'm going to outsource this until I'm in a capacity to think about insourcing. So you want to think about your capital investments, like machinery, anything that is going to cost a lot of money. You want to make sure you understand your growth plans and projections to see how much you actually need as you're growing. Because if you invest and assume that you're going to have, 2,000 customers in year 2, but maybe you don't get that, but you already invested the amount of capital and machinery to put in there, you might be in a bigger issue. So thinking about when to do so, when is the right time, is really thinking about how much you can go without it. So for example, we at Starbucks, in the last project that I was working on, we are thinking about our roastery and reserves, and we want to expand our footprint throughout the country. And so that takes a lot of operations to think about, since we actually only have 3 kitchens to support that, one in New York, one in Chicago, and one in Seattle for the current portfolio that we have. So if we were to expand that, that means, do we add another kitchen? Where should it be? How close should it be to our distribution centers? How many people would we hire? And what machinery do we need? So all those questions are the things that we're thinking through, even as a bigger company. And we had to kind of think about, okay, well, in year 1, this is a projection. So it doesn't really make sense until we have this happen. So it's a lot of thinking about how much can you do before you make that very big investment, and thinking creatively, so that way you don't end up having a big bill that you may not need fully. So that's important to know. And again, onshoring versus reshoring, I think that goes back to the earlier questions, seem to think about sourcing. Do you work with manufacturing areas that are in the U.S. or outside? Again, it really depends on what you're valuing as a supply chain. Is it low cost, or is it flexible and resilient? You can't get all of it. So you kind of have to decide, do you want speed? Do you want cost? Or do you want flexibility, right? Like there's different ways that you have to be able to target what you need and what you want at the stage that you're in. And again, similar to sourcing, when you're working with manufacturing centers, you really want to understand the production speed and volume flexibility. So, if you're telling your customers you're going to be able to have something within 5 days, is that realistic? What you're telling the customer and promise to the customer, is it realistic to have that? So I think it's really important. What doesn't really get talked about is like, when you think about speed to the customer, how quickly can you actually create something from scratch? And are you going to have a manufacturing process where maybe, I don't know, 50% is already created, so it's just a touch and go? Or is it every single time it's custom for the customer? So really thinking about what works for you and the stage of where you are as a company. Any questions there? Okay, I'll go into the next one. So planning. So think about planning as you have your sourcing, where your suppliers, their raw ingredients, your manufacturing, so when you're seeing everything come to life from a raw ingredient to a finished good. And planning is honestly not my favorite because it's a lot of numbers and you have to be really detail oriented, but it's probably the most integral part of supply chain, because this is a part where you really have to think through of working with your business leads. So depending again on your side, like, is it the marketing and operations, to really understand the vision of the company and what you're promising to customers, and can you actually deliver it? Like, can you do that on time every single time? So this is where you have to understand your supply and demand and be able to have very consistent conversations with your business strategy leads or whoever it is, and to understand, how much supply do you need? What's the demand? Is that changing? Does that change how you're thinking about your sourcing and manufacturing processes? So it's really important. And I would say too, like going line by line here, in terms of inventory management, these are policies and systems in place for maximizing your use of inventory. So there's a whole planning could get very detailed. So you have 3 parts. So you have your supply forecasting, your demand forecasting, and your replenishment. So I'll put it in context for Starbucks. So when we're thinking about coffee for supply, we're thinking, okay, how much coffee do we need from these suppliers and for X amount of time? So for in a given year, is this how much we're going to buy? Then we work with sourcing to make sure that, hey, yep, these coffee farmers can supply that for that demand. And demand, that changes, right? Especially last year, for example, when what we had projected, obviously, for the end of 2020 is very different to what happened. And so you want to make sure that your inventory management is flexible, because if something like that happens and you bought for a whole year, what are you going to do with all that waste? So it's very important to think about your supply and demand and in working with that consistently and flexible. And then replenishment is, at the end of the day, it's replenishing what you already have. So for us, what we think about is you have your supply and your demand forecast, and you have your replenishment for when we see customers are buying more, so on a day-to-day basis. So we actually I'm working on a program right now where we are updating our systems to, it's called O9, which usually works, I believe, with much bigger companies, but they are helping us make sure we have a strong replenishment system where we understand the customer needs in a much faster way than currently our system does. So it'll tell us, okay, in Southern California, we're seeing bagels to fly off the roof. Okay, great. And in the next couple of days, here's how our replenishment strategy changes to meet that demand. So it really is important for to have someone, if you're really starting from scratch, someone that's strong in understanding the customer needs, the supply chain process, and how quickly you can adapt those forecasts. And again, this is not my area of expertise, but it's this kind of general understanding about what I have been planning. Go ahead.
Yeah, just another question. So do you have any kind of tips or things to think about if you're pre-launch with in terms of the planning and figuring out exactly, exactly as much as possible, what kind of volume you should be sourcing when you don't actually have any kind of data to go off of?
Yeah, it's tough. I would say, to give you an example, like usually I would say, if you have certain data, use that data to inform your better decision of like, hey, our customers want X amount of bagels, and that's similar to what this product will be, right? But I think if you're starting from scratch, you really are working from nothing in terms of data. I would recommend thinking about your competitors and thinking about the data that you can translate into something meaningful. Because I think in the beginning too, it's a lot of testing and seeing. You might assume that, you're going to go through 100 cases a week, and maybe it's 200. And so a lot of it is both seeing what data you can get from others, and then also testing and seeing what works for your company at that time. And as you continue getting more and more data, you can be more flexible and understanding of those forecasts. And to give you an example, like as I was mentioning earlier, like I was working on a project of expanding our reserve and roastery footprint. And so we used kind of some of the information that we had, but we also combined it with our core store information, right? So we don't have information of like what, how a reserve like fancy store would do in Dallas, because we don't have one. So we use a combination of core store information and then also just ability to also make a lot of assumptions. And from when you first start, there's a lot of assumptions that you're making. And even us as a big company, there's a lot of assumptions, and you'll learn by doing what works and what doesn't.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. And again, like my last very important point is that you have to be in lockstep with your sales and operation team. Like you really want to make sure they, you know what they're projecting, so that way you're not caught blindsided that maybe they made an order to a very important customer, maybe you can't meet that. So it's important to be in lockstep with your sales and operations. And it's usually called S&OP meetings, where you really understand the sales projection, the operations capability to meet that demand, and the strategic way as how you as a company are thinking about meeting that. Okay, any other questions? Okay, last area, logistics. So this is the area I've been in the last 3 years, where it's really fascinating, and not supply chain in general is not really talked about, but logistics is not really talked about until recently, because as we all see companies like Amazon, their ways of thinking about warehousing and warehousing strategy is really impacting the local community. So as you guys remember, I think it was a year ago or something that, Amazon announced that they were going to add more warehouses in different parts of the country, and people were bidding for different areas because it does have such a big impact. So picking a location matters depending on where your customers, suppliers, and your labor force is. So it's really important to make sure that a warehouse that you're working with, either insourcing or outsourcing, we have both, is really key to where your customers are. Because if you pick a warehouse that's in Arkansas, but most of your customers are actually on the West Coast, like, are you going to be dealing with delays? Are you going to have to be visiting more often, having to check on that? So it's important to have an understanding of where it's important to meet those three customers, which is, again, your main customers, where your workforce is, and now I forgot the other one. Where your people are, I believe. Yes. So just making sure you have that clear. Oh, your suppliers. There we go. Suppliers in terms of that. So just being able to understand that. And so for us, we have both insource and outsource. So we have some that we have around the country. I believe it's like 6 or 8 that we control and operate. And mostly those are roasting plants that we have. And we actually have one in my hometown in York, Pennsylvania, which is central. When we first started growing as a company back in like the 80s and 90s, it was central for our East Coast growth. So wasn't exactly like in New York City, right? You don't want to be in high cost areas. You want an area that's really has ample space to grow and that has the workforce that you need and for your customer base. So we knew as a company that we were going to eventually grow throughout the East Coast. And so that was a location that continues to thrive in terms of the work that we do. But we also outsource some of that. So we have both roasting plants and what we call central distribution centers. And we're right now actually thinking about the strategy around these because the central distribution centers came later in the Starbucks story, and they were really thinking about frozen food at the time, and so different temperatures. So that's another important thing to think about is the warehouse that you're picking, whether it's in-source or outsource, can they meet the criteria of the product that you have? So for us, we have both frozen and perishable goods, so they need to be kept at certain temperatures that are different than what we first started with. And right now we're actually thinking about, should we consolidate, because we have both CDCs and what we call RDCs, roasting plants, where, how we've changed as a company. So some of that might change as you grow, where you were originally thought, hey, I first started with this one product and now I have variety. And so it might change over time. And so having flexibility, again, going back to negotiation and contracts and how much you want to invest in your company and the capital expenditure of these contracts. And then distribution operations. So how do these things run? So I love this part. I actually visited the Nashville one and our York, Pennsylvania one, because that's where my family lives in the last year or so. And this is like shopping. So if you think about it, like you go into a distribution center, for us, we have it's just amazing to think. Like I went to one area where you see all the coffee bags that are coming from all around the world, and it's just aisles and aisles and aisles of that, and you're just amazed of the amount of product. For me, it's always like, wow, every single day we make it happen that this coffee bag somehow turns into a cup of coffee to a customer, and it's just really cool experience. And so when you think about a distribution center, you're not going to have always depending on if you have a retail store or what your footprint is. For us, like we have distribution centers where we have an area that has like a bottled water, we have the chips, we have the coffee, right? And so if a store needs a combination of that, there's someone that's going and literally picking and putting into a consolidated shipment. And so it kind of feels like shopping. I went through that kind of experience what that felt like. And so if you're going to have something like that it's going to have multiple products, you really have to think about the logistics and thinking about how it should be set up. So Amazon obviously is famous for this. They have so many products and they think about their warehousing depending on their customer and where products they mostly use and what they're ordering and how they stack that. Right now, Microsoft is working on using VR, right? So they put one of those HoloLens and like they can look through the distribution center, say, hey, this order has water, chocolate, etc. Okay, it's over here, and they put it together. So that is innovation that we're looking at that's really exciting because one, reduces the amount of time to be able to deliver something. Two, for the workers, it makes the work much more interesting and it allows them to develop much quicker. So there's a lot of right now work towards how to make more distribution centers much more efficient with technology and thinking about your labor force there. And then the last thing here is around last mile. So this is kind of what I worked with more specifically in the last 2 years, is thinking about from our distribution centers to our stores. So for people that work in direct to consumer, it might be from your distribution center to the direct customer. So it really depends on what your strategy is. But for us, it's from the distribution center to the store in terms of what happens. So, and then obviously it comes to the end customer through the barista, right? So for us in the last mile, you're working with transportation vendors, right? For us, we're dealing with the volumes are truckloads and truckloads, and we're thinking about lanes of how much we can put on a truck. So it really depends on the size of the company that you're working with, but for a much smaller company, you're probably most likely outsourcing this to you could do like as small as a FedEx or as UPS in terms of who you're working with. But there's also there's like Uber Freight and like Expo and all these other companies that help you get that last mile done. This is an area that's growing like crazy. One, obviously in the last X amount of years, I think 10 years, amount of e-commerce that has driven the demand for faster and faster shipments to the customer. And so there's just much more an increase of demand for drivers. So this is a cost that you should all be worried about, because whether it's you're outsourcing or insourcing or working with someone that's doing your last mile for you, the cost of your transportation will be much higher than you probably experience or thought so, because of the lack of drivers right now. So for example, in the last project that I worked on, when in the Chicago market, before we opened the Chicago roastery, we were thinking about at Starbucks, like, should we insource? Like, we don't have that many stores in this portfolio. Maybe we should just do it on our own, hire a couple drivers and call it a day. Let me tell you, it is not that easy. I worked with this team to think through of not only the worker safety, so there's a specific license to be a driver, and so depending on the cargo that you're adding to that driver, it really depends on the license that you have, which I had no idea about, which was not fun, as it changes the cost projections that you were thinking. So what we thought was going to be cheap is actually a lot more expensive. Secondly is the safety. I mean, driving a truck is much different than driving a car. And so I'm very risk averse, especially Starbucks being the brand that I represent. If there's an accident, that Starbucks name on the newspaper of driver accident, and you just want to be really careful of the risks that you're taking as a brand when you're deciding to insource something, whether that's your supplier or at the end of the last mile. It really depends on what risk you're comfortable with. And so for us, it didn't really make sense to insource because that's not our expertise. It's, other companies are doing that well. And so even if it costs more, and I think that's a lesson for any of these things, even if it costs more, think about what you want to focus on versus what you want to outsource to someone else that is their expertise, because any part of the supply chain is pretty complicated. So it's important to know what is your core competencies as a company and what other parts you're willing to pay even a bit more, but you know that you trust that it will get done. So I know I just went through a lot, and that could be overwhelming if you have no idea about supply chain, but I hope at least so far that's making sense, and hoping that provides a little bit more clarity of the different things that you should think about. And again, it really depends on the type of company, what type of product that you have, and the stage that you're in, and depending on that. So again, happy to discuss more one-on-one, but are there any other questions before I jump into COVID-19 impact? Okay, I'll go to the next slide, and happy to take more questions afterwards. Although I know
It did just come through.
Oh, okay.
What systems/tools do you use for project management?
Yes, so for project management, we usually use Microsoft services. So there's Microsoft Project. We're using Jira right now because the project I'm working on is much more of a tech project. So if you're not familiar with Jira, it's the best way to use. It's, I think, I forget how you say it, but it's a Plesion or something like that. That is a main provider. We also use Trello, and Smartsheet is something that Starbucks absolutely loves. In every single project I'm in, we use Smartsheet for either project plans, surveys, and pretty much everything. I highly recommend Smartsheet if you haven't heard of it. Okay, I know we only have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to go through this pretty quickly, but again, I think it's just a lot of things that you guys can see in the news anyway, but in some of it, again, going back to the earlier slides, this should be a reinforcement of how important this is. So for sourcing, it's really what we've learned and seen is that if you only have one supplier that you're working with from a single region, you might be in trouble. In the last year, we saw that people that only had one single supplier and hey, they were in China, you couldn't get it through, what to do in those last minutes. So it's always important to have a contingency plan if your specific supplier you're working with cannot deliver. Same thing to understand the continuity and plans for your supplier. And maybe they are your top supplier for your top item that you need. What are they going to do in a time of crisis? How do they, react? How do they make sure that their labor force is going to be up and running? Like making sure that they have that and working with them to understand that. Because if we've learned anything in the last year is that you don't know what you don't know, and no one would have predicted COVID-19. So again, one of the things to think about is, diversifying that supply base and making sure you have at least different options for alternative suppliers, and creating a disruption and playbook and contingency plan for key items. It's really important, because otherwise, you'll see one of the things that probably all customers saw is out of stock. And that is not something that you want to be in a situation where it's less so about the shipping delays, or less so something that you can control and influence, but because your supplier wasn't able to deliver. So if that's one thing I would recommend, is just making sure that you as a company have a disruption playbook, and that your suppliers also do, and that you have conversations about that. And just reiterating the importance of supplier transparency in terms of times of issues or global pandemics, that there's constant communication of issues and how they're going to resolve that. Manufacturing, so this will come through in every single part of it, but labor shortages, as you can imagine right now, and especially in the beginning when no one really knew how to handle it in terms of safety and workforce flexibility, is that we saw a lot of companies struggle with labor shortages because people were getting sick. So that's one, again, putting people first, making sure that you're working with suppliers and manufacturing in a way that they're putting people first and putting the safety and health much more important than anything else, and creating a disruption playbook there, but also understanding their production schedule. So, maybe they had a team of 40 people and now they only have 10. Like, how are they thinking about getting the work done given that amount of change in terms of their labor shortage? Similarly for plant closures. So we actually went through this many times. There were situations where in the beginning we said, hey, if there's one person in the whole plant that gets COVID, we're shutting it down for huge, cleaning, etc. Over time, we've learned how much actually needs to happen, and as we've learned as a country and a world of what needs to happen each time. So we've gotten better and better about it. But closing a plant for 6 hours can definitely change your delays and what you're able to produce. So it's really important to understand how either you or the company you're working with are thinking about plant closures, and again, the safety and health of the people. Excess inventory. So similar to what I mentioned before, this goes to inventory management, understanding what you will do in those times where you have excess inventory because either demand has changed, as in the last year it has. For us, most of the time, what we did is donate. So we worked with food banks to make sure that food was getting to the right people, even if it wasn't for our customer. And that was like one, I'm so proud to make sure that we were able to deliver so much to the people in need. So it's important to have a strategy and be able to give quick guidance so that they know what to do with that. And that's also why it's important to have clear communication and relationship with your community. So in times of need, you don't have to figure out which food bank you should work with or in terms of those situations. If you cannot donate, there are ways to get rid of your product. So if it's clothing, it might be to a different retailer. So thinking about what does that look like for your specific industry in terms of those situations. For planning, so again, very similar to discussed earlier. So in the last year, we saw a lot of supply and demand shocks where whether it was you couldn't get product through the borders and you'd have to figure out what to do next, or demand completely changed, especially in the first couple of months. We obviously all saw everyone working from home and what to do in those moments, and we had no idea when it would quote unquote back to normal or to some relatively stable situation. So that's why it's so important to, one, plan for long-term downturn still through this pandemic. I mean, I think for right now, things are looking better, but we still should be much more risk averse in making sure you have enough safety stock. So the extra stock to be able to provide to the customer if you don't have it in your production, and also what to do in terms of excess inventory. So being able to have like different options in terms of that quickly changing supply and demand. And again, we saw a lot of shipping delays, as you guys saw pictures of UPS and FedEx being completely backlogged. Is being realistic with your customers of some things are out of your control and influence. You may have the product ready, but now it's out of your hands. So having very clear communication to your customers, whether it's wholesale or direct to end, of what they should be expecting, right? I've seen all these different types of companies let me know like, hey, your Amazon order is going to be X amount of days delayed. So being able to have that clear communication. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important already to have a strong sales and operation team and communication, but more so during these times. I mean, I wasn't part in these conversations, but I know the very beginning and still to today, they have every day 30-minute SWAT team conversations of what to do and being able to have a strategy. And in a company as large as Starbucks, sometimes it's difficult to make decisions quickly. And it really was empowering our people to do the right thing with information they had at the time. So a lot of time you're betting on the best that you can do with the time that you have and then resources and information that you have at that time. Last one, just inventory placement challenges. Again, similar to some of the issues that we had in manufacturing, maybe your distribution center is not ready to receive. Maybe they have too much product. They can't receive all the information or all the product that you have. You have to know how long you can hold it at your manufacturing center before you deliver to the end customer. And lastly, so logistics, we saw delays not only to the end customer in terms of shipping, but also ocean, land, and air freight. So we did all these different types of things to make sure that our product got there at the right time. But when you're thinking about like how we were sourcing PPE, it was very difficult just knowing the delays that would happen. So again, going back to the importance of having visibility and communication with your operations team of assuming like when's the earliest and latest you can have this product by and having realistic understanding of that. And again, we had so many real-time logistics changes. I mean, over the summer when I was in the reserve and roastery logistics team in Chicago, we were not only dealing with the pandemic, but also the Black Lives Matter protest, where it was, also dealing with the city putting up the bridges and our trucks couldn't go through the city. So thinking about being on the call, figuring out what to do next was really critical. And so having a team that's willing and ready to do whatever is needed to, one, put people first, making sure that people are safe in those deliveries. A lot of times we would ask the drivers to go back home because it wasn't safe for them to deliver. Secondly, like if they do feel safe, making sure that they have the right information, know what to do, and leave the product safely. And again, similar to last time, labor shortage. I mean, not only did we already have this with drivers already as an industry, but continued so with the number of COVID cases throughout the world and just the impact it happens on your labor. So if you don't have enough drivers, how are you getting it to your last mile to your end customer? So I just talked a bunch. I hope that's a quick summary of just like the supply chain process, things to think about, lessons learned. A lot of my experience comes from Starbucks, but I've also worked with small brands like Bubble Bar and ClassPass, where I've seen, scaling issues happen when you ignore the operation. So it's really critical that even if your company is not as large as Starbucks, thinking about the importance of the behind the scenes work, because don't pay attention to it, it will come and bite you. Whether that's in 5 years or when you're at a growth mode that you're wondering what to do next. So I know we're almost at or over time. So happy to answer questions. And again, happy to talk one-on-one.
This was incredible. I learned so much in this past hour. Thank you so much for just giving us all these incredible learning lessons that you've developed over the years. This was like a total crash course in supply chain. Again, if you want to connect with Martha one-on-one, let me drop her email again in case anyone joined after. So generous. Thank you so much for offering that. And if anyone has any last minute questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or just unmute yourself. And in the meantime, I remembered that we're having this event coming up called Should You Launch a Physical Product? So I feel like if someone maybe hasn't launched yet, it could be relevant for you, even if you already have launched, just to get that perspective as well. So I just dropped that in the chat. But if there are no last minute questions, we can go ahead and wrap up. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you, Martha, for pouring into the collective and sharing your expertise and continuing to give back. We're so grateful for you. It's amazing to see you all and just have this learning experience. And I hope you all have an incredible rest of your day.
Thank you. Thanks for your time, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.